The All In podcast is one of the most popular podcasts in the world. Last week's episode peaked at number 8 overall on the Apple Podcast charts, and yet it was borderline unwatchable, and I know I am far from the only person who feels that way. Just peruse their YouTube comment section and you will see it is filled with, frankly, a lot of OG fans who are very frustrated by what this podcast has become. And this week's episode was frankly just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what has started to go wrong over at the All In podcast. If you don't know, it is a show hosted by 4 very wealthy men who are very well connected within Silicon Valley and now in politics. And despite the fact that they are good friends with Elon Musk and one of the members of the podcast actually works for the Trump administration, they did not address the Elon-Trump feud. And that is the inciting incidents. That is what has made so many fans mad this week. But frankly, it is actually emblematic of a much deeper rot that feels like it has taken root in a podcast that was once a place for independent thinking and good faith conversations and disagreements, and now frankly feels like it's mostly bad faith conversations among people who still believe they're independent thinkers, but in fact are very much not. And so today we are pulling back the curtain and talking about exactly what is happening at the All In podcast that has made it feel so different from the show it once was, why so many OG fans are frustrated, and why frankly they have a unique opportunity to actually help solve the problems, the rot that is at the core of American politics today, but in fact they are abdicating that responsibility and making it worse. I'm Carly Riley, this is the Carly P. Riley Show. I look at what powerful people are saying and I ask, what the fuck? What the fuck are you talking about? What the fuck are they talking about over at the All In podcast? Fans of the show are upset because they didn't talk in any meaningful way this week about what happened between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And that is frustrating because you are talking about 4 men who have, generally speaking, really eschewed the mainstream media or have been advocates in both direct and subtle ways of not paying attention to the mainstream media and getting your information from sources like on X and frankly from independent podcasts like theirs. And then what happens when the biggest story that intersects tech, finance, and politics, the arenas that they cover, when that big story breaks, they don't talk about it because frankly they're too conflicted. Somebody commented on the YouTube video and they said, "This is a great example that shows everyone can compromise their principles for the opportunity of being closest to power." But the truth is, this Elon Musk addressing it, not addressing it, it is to me not the bigger story. It is not the real rot at the core of this podcast that I once really, really loved. The All In podcast has been compromised for a while now, and it's not just about being in somebody's pocket. It's because the podcast itself has created a world in which it now lives. And this world, it has sprung from the primordial ooze of a David Sachs conservative group chat in which no liberals are allowed. And all debate within the show now happens within the context of that world. So this podcast that once felt like it was open to many different viewpoints, that represented different viewpoints, that represented being able to disagree with one another in good faith, now fundamentally represents one viewpoint, but they continue to perform as if they offer you many. So let's venture into this world. Tucker Carlson was their guest on the show this week, and he shared his thoughts on why Donald Trump, of course, had to send troops into Los Angeles to quell the protests/riots that were going on.
Well, considering that we have American troops in over 100 bases around the world in countries most Americans can't identify, it's a little weird to be shocked when, on that rare occasion, they're used to keep the second biggest city in the country from burning down. It seems like the point of having a military is to keep foreigners from burning your cities.
Yes, of course. It is ridiculous. It is crazy to find it remotely weird that the president would send military into Los Angeles. Because, of course, in the world in which the All In podcast now exists, there are only 2 kinds of people. There are people who see common sense, who understand that obviously you need to do anything you can to prevent your second largest city from burning down from foreign invaders who are waving foreign flags and literally lighting your city on fire. And then there are people who support lawlessness, who support literally the looters and the arsonists. I'm being hyperbolic, of course. They're not literally saying that Democrats are just supporters of looters and arsonists.
So once again, they're siding with looters, arsonists, and violent criminals, just like in 2020.
Just kidding. That's literally what the All In podcast is saying. David Sachs is saying that the Democrats are siding with the looters, the arsonists, and the violent criminals, because that, again, is the world in which the All In podcast, which was once about independent thought and good faith arguments, that is the world in which they now live. Now, to Jason Calcanis' credit, he tries to push back on this to say, well, that's not really what the Democrats are standing for.
Who's siding with
This is
them?
Democrats.
Okay, because the Democrats, they
Go
said
ahead.
no violence. So that was many times Gavin Newsom said no violence, Karen Bass said no violence. They've been tweeting that
They
constantly.
also, okay, great. They also are saying that this is all Trump's fault, that Trump started this.
What happens when there is the slightest bit of pushback that says, hey, maybe the Democrats aren't actually entirely in favor of lawlessness and looters and arsonists, and that's not whose side they're actually on? David Sachs concedes it in an incredibly dismissive way. Okay, great, as if Jason is sort of saying something ridiculous, and then says, they're still saying it's all Trump's fault. Pivot to make sure that it is always on the Democrats, all while you talk about how the Democrats always make it about you. And the problem with Jason's pushback, though I admire his effort, is that he is actually actually not a good spokesperson for the most rational, reasonable versions of the Democratic arguments. And so nobody on this podcast actually presents the strong argument for what Democrats are actually saying, which means that what happens instead is that Jason's attempts at pushing back on David Sacks only make David Sacks and Tucker Carlson look stronger. The strongest argument, the obvious argument that Democrats are making is that if you take in totality what Donald Trump is doing, it is very unprecedented and it is reasonable to be nervous about it. Donald Trump has done something that no president has ever done. He federalized the National Guard and sent them and the Marines into Los Angeles over the objections of the sitting California governor who has not broken the law. That has never happened before. Then that same president suggested on national TV that maybe they should arrest the governor of California, who again has not in fact actually broken the law. And I get that Donald Trump says a lot of things, but look at this from Democrats' perspectives. His administration has defied the Supreme Court and lied about it on national television. He's joking, but maybe not, about running for a third term. He has illegally deported people to El Salvador, to a prison system that is outside the bounds of U.S. law, U.S. human rights, U.S. control, and nobody, by the way, has seen the contract between the U.S. government and CCOT, this prison in which they are disappearing people. And on top of that, this same weekend, Donald Trump is going to throw a military parade on his own goddamn birthday? For David Sacks to not have any respect for the 50% of Americans, your fellow countrymen, who are concerned about what is happening in this country, who are concerned about Donald Trump, who look at the set of facts that I just outlined and go, yeah, I'm nervous about this, to have so little respect for them that you won't even engage with their arguments, that you want to pretend they're arguing something fundamentally different because you're taking the arguments of a fringe set of radicals that don't represent the majority of the country and not even the majority of Democrats, but to be so dehumanizing and denigrating to them that you won't even actually consider their arguments is to engage in the kind of bad faith argumentation and certainly a lack of independent thinking that this podcast once stood so firmly against. I love the Harry Potter books. I swear this is relevant. I love the Harry Potter books. And I love the Harry Potter books, even though I'm not a big fantasy person. I don't love fantasy books, because Harry Potter lives in a fictional world and a fantasy world that is set atop and interwoven within modern London as of, I don't know, whatever, the late 90s, early 2000s. And that is what the All In podcast has become. They have created a fictional, fantastical world of their own imaginations that has interwoven so seamlessly with the real world that is what has become so disorienting about listening to this podcast as people who are deep fans of this podcast, OG fans of the podcast. I mean, you're nodding along because they're saying something reasonable. Look, it's reasonable to criticize the Democrats. Frankly, it seems to be true that Joe Biden basically had an open border policy that let millions upon millions of illegal immigrants into the country that the country can't really sustain. And you'll be nodding along because they're saying something like that, and they're like, and this, and you're like, yes, yes, yes. And then suddenly they're going, and that's why we need to send the military into Los Angeles to capture all of the Dementors. And you're like, I'm sorry, what? And you're like, you're almost there. You're like, yeah, that is what. And then they right turn into literal fantasy land. This notion that Los Angeles is burning to the ground, that this was some sort of foreign invasion to the scale that would require U.S. military intervention that is, by the way, arguably illegal. It's being played out into the courts right now if Donald Trump had the legal right to even do what he did. And to not address those legal questions at all, to act like it was the most natural, understandable thing in the world for Donald Trump to do what he did because Los Angeles was burning to the ground by foreign invaders, which is the term that both David Sacks and Tucker Carlson used on this podcast, is to live in a fantasy land. Anybody who knows anyone who was in Los Angeles this weekend can tell you that is not what was going on. And this is the shift that has occurred within this podcast over the last 5 years. And it's honestly so upsetting because they actually have a unique opportunity. They have a unique opportunity to de-escalate the rhetoric in the country right now. They built a base of fans who are often people who are independent-minded, who are not ideological, who are not wedded to one party or another. And this could be a group of people that are mobilized to de-escalate the rhetoric, to reach across the aisle, to find common ground, to not let this get to a point where we literally are killing each other. And instead, they are going the other direction. Listen to Tucker Carlson on this show with zero pushback from any of the co-hosts suggest that the protests that occurred in Los Angeles this weekend were more serious than the fight that set off the Civil War.
There's certainly a bigger deal than anything that happened in Fort Sumter, for sure, which kicked off the bloodiest war in American history. There's a lot at stake, and we reached this point because a series of paradoxically weak federal governments allowed sanctuary cities to continue literally for decades, each one its own form of insurrection against the central government. I mean, certainly federal troops have been called in for much less.
No, that's wrong on the history and on the facts. It's wrong in so many ways. Central governments didn't allow sanctuary cities to exist as their own little forms of insurrection. The courts upheld it. Sanctuary cities have been understood to be allowed to exist because of the 10th Amendment, which is the same amendment that allows individual cities to not enforce certain gun regulations that the federal government has imposed. So it is wrong on the facts, on the law. And by the way, to suggest that this protest in Los Angeles was more serious than the Battle of Fort Sumter, which kicked off the Civil War, which, by the way, occurred because South Carolina had already seceded from the Union. You're comparing this to a time when a country had already seceded. He says it so casually, and yet it is so escalatory. He's saying there's a lot at stake. I mean, they are using language here that is really demonizing the other side, and I get the other side demonizes them right back, but the truth is you are in power. You could dial the tone back, and you're choosing not to. Everyone who has watched this show for years, like me, obviously knows that it is shifted to the right. We have felt that for years now. But it has gotten to the point where it has shifted so far to the right that it doesn't even acknowledge that a rational left exists. And that is rotten. That is what is rotten in American politics today, is the idea that there isn't a rational version of the other side. And it is what has now become rotten in this podcast, emblemized by this podcast that I used to love. So the truth is, not addressing Elon and Trump's feud, it is just the tip of the iceberg. Yes, it shows that they are not as independent as they like to seem, but the reality is the rest of the show is actually more troublesome. It's created this world that is rooted in some reality, but rooted in a lot of fiction, and nobody is there to call it out. And that is what has happened to the All In podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I would love if you would consider sharing it with somebody else who you think might enjoy it, or subscribing to the channel.